Okay, go.
Well, hello, everybody. Keith has kindly invited me back, which I was surprised at. And he's allowed me to appear a little bit earlier than I normally would because I have business literally across the way in the Crown Court this morning and this afternoon. You may, had you seen the previous interview I had with him, heard him say to me that I had a wide remit. Unwise words, Keith. Because he's sitting here having his coffee and a well-earned rest next to me. Because I've got a number of pet topics that I'd like to talk to you about. And the first one is about what is probably the most well-known solicitor in the whole of Sussex ever. And that's quite a accolade. This is Charles Dawson. I've got my notes here, so I'm just going to need to refer to them. He was born in 1864 and he died in 1916. He was born in Preston. But in fact, his family moved to Sussex when he was very young, and he was a Lewisian for most of his life. Dare I say it in the same way that I wasn't born in Lewes, but after almost a quarter of a century, consider myself to be a Lewisian. He was a solicitor who came from a family that was quite successful. He probably wasn't as successful as others, and it may well be that he had a little bit of resentment about that. In many ways, he achieved a lot. He didn't go to university. He qualified as a solicitor, as he could do then, and you still can do now, by effectively having an apprenticeship where you work on the job and take your exams in your spare time. He is a founding partner of the firm of Dawson Hart, who still are considered to be a very reputable firm based in Uckfield, which is a town a few miles north of Lewes. He was the Dawson of it. The other partner, George Hart, in fact became the official solicitor. So he must have been a very eminent lawyer. The official solicitor is somebody who, back in the day, and still to a certain extent nowadays, represents people who are under a disability, so people who can't represent themselves in proceedings. And certainly when I started practice, which is 30 odd years ago, prior to the implementation of the Children Act, most cases involving child care involve the official solicitor acting on behalf of the child. And I did lots of cases acting on behalf of the official solicitor in what were called wardship proceedings. And Keith will know this, I'm sure, that if you're familiar with the works of Gilbert and Sullivan, in Iolanthe, the Lord Chancellor has many troubles with his wards of court, that is, the children who he had to look after, and he had the official solicitor in order to assist him in court in looking after them. Anyway, that's the Hart part of Dawson Hart. Interesting fellow in his own right. Charles Dawson, I'm not quite sure how hard he worked, actually, because albeit he became the clerk to the justices in Uckfield, effectively you're the legal advisor to the lay magistrates. You tell them what the law is, and probably back in his Edwardian times, you also told them how to decide the cases. So he wasn't without his own merit as a lawyer. But he seemed to find a huge amount of time to be an amateur archaeologist and paleontologist, and he was very successful at that. I don't know. Here's him on a dig that we'll come to in due course. He appears somehow to have found lots of time in his life to do that sort of thing. You know, I have difficulty catching a quick coffee with you and Keith here, whereas dear old Charles seemed to be able to do lots of things. But he was, as I say, very successful. He was termed by a local newspaper in Sussex as the Wizard of Sussex, because he found lots of things. He found silhouettes on the walls of the dungeons of Hastings Castle, which he published about. He excavated the Lavant Caves over near Chichester. He found a toad in a flint that when he opened it, the toad was this petrified toad, was not petrified in the literal sense, not in the sense that it was desiccated in a flint. And in fact, you can still see that in the Booth Museum in Brighton, and I commend that to you if you're ever in Brighton. It's a little bit of a walk out of the middle of the town, but it is an extraordinary, small yet fascinating museum. And a range of other things. He found 3 new dinosaurs. He found a tooth from a mammal that had never been seen before, which was named after him. He found a plant, a fossilized plant that was named after him as well. And in fact, as a consequence of his various finds, he was given a number of accolades. He became an honorary collector of the British for the British Museums. That, in other words, an amateur, but nevertheless recognised as somebody who was very capable. He was a fellow of the Geological Society, and he was a member of the Society of Antiquaries. But his biggest find came in 1912, so that's 4 years before he died, when he went and dug in a gravel pit in Piltdown, which is a little bit further north than Uckfield is from Lewes. And he found bones there. He found a piece of skull, and he found a jawbone, which appeared to be, no pun intended on the face of it, part of the same being. And he took them to the Natural History Museum. He took them to Arthur Smith Woodward, who was one of the most eminent practitioners in his area at the time. He was the world authority, for example, on fish fossils. I know that may sound a bit boring, but he was very well thought of. And Arthur Smith Woodward concluded that these were, in fact, part of the missing link between humans and their pre-hominid precursors. Those bones were then the subject of and this is him actually at the pit where he found them. Those bones were subject of a paper written principally by Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, but assisted by Dawson. And it was named Eoanthropus dawsoni, which means Dawson's dawn man. So it's dawn meaning the start of man, but named specifically after Charles Dawson, and was taken as the missing link. It's an interesting time within archaeology because there were lots of finds being made at that time on the continent. Neanderthal man had been found in Germany in the Neander Valley. There were cave paintings found in Spain and in France. And there was a strong sense within Britain that there was a need to show that we were the cradle of humanity, because that was an essential part of the empire. And so people were more than willing to accept this as being proof of that position. This is all predates what is now accepted, which is this sort of out of Africa theory of human evolution. And so Dawson was lauded by his peers. He was considered to be a very eminent person. And everyone assumed that Piltdown Man was exactly what he said it was. Why would a solicitor, a clerk to a justice of the peace, do anything other than tell as it was? And in fact, he was able to support his findings by a couple of years later finding another tooth, very similar to the tooth in the original Piltdown 1 find. So this was known as Piltdown 2, which showed the same characteristics, which fortified the belief in this happening. The difficulty with Piltdown Man is it didn't fit with other findings. It didn't really fit with Neanderthals, didn't fit with the increasing number of hominids that were being found in China and increasingly in Africa, because Piltdown Man appears to have a human-sized skull, in other words, a big brain, but still has a massive jaw. And all the other findings were the other way around, where the jaw receded into its, I've got a tiny jaw, but a normal sized jaw, and then the brain grew. And that was all part of evolution, where humans were able to create for themselves more nutritious food through primitive farming and hunting, cooking meat, for example, in order to add protein to their diet. So it was a little bit of an outlier, but nobody had a problem with it. It was just there, and it was thought maybe to be a branch of the evolution of humanity that may or may not have led to what we are now. I'm sure that Keith has a little bit of Neanderthal in him there. Now, Charles Dawson.
Great likeness.
Yes, exactly. There we go. It doesn't have the fedora. Charles Dawson, as I said, the reason I'm talking to you about him is that he was a solicitor. And here's an interesting little factoid, is that he was the solicitor to the Sussex Archaeological Society, based in Lewes. And I let me give you my take on this. I am a member of the Sussex Archaeological Society. I recommend it to you because it gives you free access to not only the castle here, but also Anne of Cleves House, which has some interesting items in it, and various other sites within Sussex of interest. So you don't have to be, I've never dug anything up other than maybe occasionally some weeds, but it's worth doing it. And one of the benefits of it is you can also go to the library here in Lewes that they have and actually see the original documents that related to Charles Dawson. Anyway, I digress. Dawson was the solicitor, as I say, for the Sussex Archaeological Society, and there is a house that those of you who live in Lewes will know, just at the back of the castle. It looks almost as if it is a bit of the castle. It's made of the same flints. It's called Castle Lodge. Owned by the Duke of Abergavenny, but with an old spinster living in it. And the agreement was that when she passed away, the Duke would sell it to the Sussex Archaeological Society as their base via Charles Dawson. She did die. It was sold, but Charles Dawson kept it for himself. So he, purporting to act for the Archaeological Society, gazumped them and bought it himself. It's an interesting little insight to his character, but it's also got it has a slight twist to it in terms of where things go from here. Because I've told you what may sound a slightly dull story, but let's move on in time. He dies in 1916. He's buried in St. John sub Castro churchyard. Well worth a visit. He's just near the memorial to the Russian soldiers, prisoners of war, who were brought over here. And it's a grave in the French style. It doesn't have a headstone, it has a metal headpiece because his wife was French. Buried there, and that was an end to it. But increasingly, over the decades, people became concerned about Piltdown Man because it didn't fit. And finally, in 1953, so we're talking 40-odd years, 41 years after it was found and declared to be important, a scientist called Kenneth Oakley and his colleagues undertook more modern scientific investigations of it. And they found that, in fact, the bones had been deliberately stained to make them look older. They found that the piece of skull was, in fact, medieval. It wasn't any older than that. It was particularly thick, but it was clearly a human skull. And importantly, they found that the jawbone, which interestingly had its connections to the skull broken off, which is an important determinant of what sort of species it comes from. The jawbone was the jawbone of an orangutan, and the teeth in it had been deliberately worn down using a file to make them look more like human teeth. And more recently, other additional work has been done at the first part of this century to show that the other tooth, for example, Piltdown 2, in fact came from the same orangutan. Now, what are the chances that orangutan lost a tooth over there and then went and died just here? It's clearly proof that this was a hoax. And the sad reality is that Charles Dawson, for all the things I've told you about him, I'm allowed to say this because he's dead, was a fraudster, a complete fraudster. But interestingly enough, not a fraudster who was seeking money. He was clearly seeking advancement with people whose opinions mattered to him. He was desperate to become a member of the Royal Society. He certainly wanted some kind of royal recognition, either a knighthood, MBE, whatever it might be. He never got any of those. There have been further investigations into all those other things that he found. The Wizard of Sussex, the Toad in the Flint. He purported to find cast iron Roman statuettes. Romans didn't do cast iron, they did different ironwork than that. They've all been shown to be frauds. There's a very interesting book about this by an academic, which shows that there are 38 separate finds that he made, which were in fact fraudulent, never actually occurred. So there he is, Charles Dawson, the most famous solicitor in Sussex. I should say this, Keith, that I would like to write, as a barrister, because you may know, there's always a slight tension between barristers and solicitors. We have to work together, but there's always a little bit of a tension. As a barrister, I'd quite like to write the book, A History of Dishonest Sussex Solicitors. My difficulty with that is that I don't think I could publish it in my lifetime because many of them would still be alive. So it would have to be left to my grandchildren that they could publish it. And just on that point, Keith, this is another complete aside. Last time we spoke, you talked about defamation and how that affects broadcasts. And I would never dream of defaming anybody. But you can't defame somebody who has died. But the case that redefined the law of defamation in this country was Yusupov against MGM. I should say that's not Keith in the lavatory, that's somebody filling a water jug in the background.
That's scary, making sure my beer is okay for tomorrow.
Yeah. So Yusupov and MGM, 1934, MGM made a film about Rasputin. And they showed a princess in there who was either seduced or raped by Rasputin. And she and her husband, Prince Yusupov, sued MGM for it. And it, two important things on that. It redefined what it is to be defamed. And it said that effectively it was sufficient that it lowered you in the thinking of right-meaning people. It didn't mean hatred, ridicule, or contempt, which it previously was. But secondly, and this is important for what Keith said to me, it also said that film or television was libel, not slander. There's a difference between the two. Libel was typically written words. Slander was spoken words. And MGM sought to argue that because it was spoken on the film, therefore it could only be slander. And with slander, you can only get damages if you can show what's called special damages. That is actually that you've made a loss out of it. Whereas with libel, you're inherently allowed to claim money. And the court determined that broadcasts like this that we're doing now, if I were to say that Keith is an utter drunkard, for example, that would be a libel, not a slander. Or it could be the absolute truth. Who knows? But anyway, it certainly wouldn't be a slander. Coming back to Charles Dawson, why does he matter? What does it matter if this man was a fraudster? He didn't make money out of anybody. He was clearly some slightly odd Walter Mitty character who did this for his own personal aggrandizement and not harming anybody else. Well, that's not quite the case. Because you remember I mentioned Sir Arthur Smith Woodward. He was the chap at the Natural History Museum who first saw the bones and accepted them as genuine. I should say this, that there are lots of other people who have been put in the frame for the hoax, including him, including there was a French priest who was an amateur archaeologist. He was also pointed at. And this is very strangely, Arthur Conan Doyle, who lived in the area and occasionally gave Charles Dawson lifts and played golf in the Piltdown area. He's been named as a possible suspect, but all that's frankly tosh. Albeit in Lewis, there are still people who think that Dawson was framed because of his gazumping of the Sussex Archaeological Society, that they set him up. It doesn't hold water as a theory, in my view. But anyway, Arthur Smith Woodward, this is the tragedy of it. He retired in 1924 from his post at the Natural History Museum. And the absolute proof, for my part, that he wasn't the perpetrator of the Piltdown hoax was that on retirement until his death 20 years later in 1944, he and his wife moved to Sussex. And he spent his retirement seeking out further proof of Piltdown remains. And of course, he found none. So Charles Dawson, solicitor and clerk to the justices, spoilt 2 decades of what should have been a good retirement for that man. And also, of course, he had the ignominy of having been fooled by what was a complete amateur. I've got a little coda to this. Quite a few years ago, I went to the Natural History Museum with my then young daughters. We looked around the place, and they thoroughly enjoyed it. And of course, the big dinosaur bones and that sort of thing, and the whale. And I met a curator, and I said, just out of interest, because it's clearly a subject that interests me. I'm a Lewisian. Charles Dawson was a Lewisian. Where are the Piltdown bones kept now? And I had such a sniffy response from this curator, who clearly didn't want to talk about a subject that is still a very sore point at the Natural History Museum, because they were ultimately fooled by a complete amateur. Sussex Archaeological Society have a different attitude. They are quite happy to expose the whole thing and occasionally have exhibitions of copies of the bones and that sort of thing. But maybe the moral of the story is this: even though it's only a Sussex rural lawyer, be careful, because they may well completely fool you. Keith, I think that's all I want to say.
Right, now let me just ask you, did Dawson suffer any material damage, or was it just his reputation that went?
No, it's just his reputation, and he was, he'd been dead for getting on for 40 years by the time it was exposed anyway. So he never knew that all of his 38 frauds had been exposed. So I'm just going to look up, because I've got the details here. The book about this, let me just find, is by Miles Russell. He's an archaeologist, and he says this of Dawson. He says, Piltdown Man was not a one-off hoax, more than the accumulation of a life's work, because he spent his life fooling people.
30, how many?
38.
That's serial, isn't it?
That is serial, yes.
Well, that's a fascinating story, and he lived just up the road.
He lives,
just
there. Castle Lodge.
Hop and a skip away. And in fact, we did a documentary called The Bloody Past of a Tiny Town, on the basis that there was more blood spilled on this high street than any other high street in the world. But actually, when you actually look at the people that have lived on the high street in the past, it's also had its fascinating characters.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, just looking ahead, you have a fascinating character that you're going to interview for us in the pretty near future.
Yes, possibly fascinating. Philip Meredith is a colleague of mine who's been at the bar even longer than I have, and has done a number of very interesting cases. And we get on well together, and we talk almost daily. But some of the cases he's been involved in have been very high profile and of interest. One in particular, which was a very serious miscarriage of justice that he could talk about, going back many years. And I'm hoping to link in with him, albeit he's not a Lewisian. He lives in Arundel, but nevertheless, his much of his life in practice has been in Lewis.
Nobody has to live here to tell tall tales about about the. I think they're just fascinated with people that have got stories to tell. I think I said to you that when I was living in Canada, that one of the favourite detective series was called Dragnet, with Sergeant Joe Friday, and he always ended up with. There are a million stories in the naked city. This is just one of them. And I always think that Lewis is the same. There are a million stories in Lewis, and this is just one of them. And we can keep on going to Kingdom Come. So I shall expect you back a lot.
Keith, before we go, at the very start of our last conversation, we spoke about Dick Barton,
Yes,
and you recalled the tune.
yes, and you didn't tell us the title.
No, and it's called The Devil's Gallop, with only one L, so it's not Gallop, Gallop.
Gallop.
It's called The Devil's Gallop.
Right.
So just if anybody wants to Spotify it or whatever you do nowadays.
Right. And it's the one tune that I can hum.
Not correctly, but he can do that.
Richard, thank you very much.
Not at all.
I'm aware that you've got to skip over the road, so we shall expect you back in the very, very near future.
Lovely.
Super. Okay. I'm waving my little wand, and I hope that here we go. We will do it the traditional way. Toodle pip.